Hi everyone, my name's Leigh Dunn. I'm from Plettenberg Bay. I'm born and bred here in New Horizons. I'm a professional remedial therapist, an educator, and a CITA accredited life coach, tutor, motivational speaker. And today it's quite an honor for me to be able to speak to you about the history of Plettenberg Bay, specifically New Horizons Township, and the contribution that my family and so many other people have made in developing this beautiful place. This is part of an oral history project of the Western Cape government, and I'm quite honored to be asked to be able to speak to you about this. The few things I'd like to talk to you about are firstly the development of New Horizons Township here in Plet as it started in 1967. I'd also like to talk to you about the Group Areas Act of 1950, how it affected my family, my grandparents, and so many other so-called colored people here in Plettenberg Bay. I also then am going to explain to you the different borders that New Horizons had. I'll tell you a little bit of how I grew up here as a child, the things we did. I'll speak about the public buildings, the first public buildings in New Horizons. And then I'll talk to you about Keerboom Road, which is one of the main streets in New Horizons at that time. Keerboom Street is still here. And I'm going to end off with a little bit of childhood memories of myself. All of this info that I'm going to share with you, I received, it's been passed on to me by my grandparents, by my family, by other important people. And one thing that I'm very happy about is that I myself have been born and bred in New Horizons here in Plettenberg Bay. This is a picture of myself, my mom and my dad, and yes, late 1970s when I was a baby and still exactly at the same place where we live right now. So it's an honor for me, and I feel that I'm quite legitimate to be able to speak to you about the history of New Horizons, seeing that I've been born and bred over here. I'd like to show a few other pictures as well. This one is how Plettenberg Bay looked at the time when my dad, as a young man, took pictures of our beautiful town. He always enjoyed his camera. He's very much like me. And he was also one of the first people who owned a camera. So this is right there at the Lookout Beach, at the Dolphin Tail, and that's how it looked in the 1950s when my dad took this photograph. It showed how bare Plet looked, very few houses over there. The next photo I'd like to show you is something similar. Also taken by my father, Mac Dunn, in the late 1950s, and that area shows that Plet Primary School is there at the moment. So of course there was no Plet Primary School, no houses up to the Old Nick. We all know Old Nick, and we also know Market Square Shopping Centre that was developed in the 1990s. No Market Square Shopping Centre. So that's how long my grandparents and my parents have been living here in Plet and seen the town develop out of nothing to what it is today. A rife, ever-developing holiday resort. But over that time, there was really nothing. The other person that I was honored to interview and who shared some of this info with me is Iris Dixon. She's 87 years old right now, and I want to tell you something interesting about Iris Dixon. She still lives here in New Horizons at the moment, and everyone knows her as Auntie I. I'll tell you a little bit more about her during my presentation, but Auntie I was born in 1933 here in New Horizons before this place was even known as New Horizons. That time it was still a farm belonging to the Topless family, and afterwards Auntie Iris' parents, Robert Charles Harker and Mary Harker, they bought part of this farm, called it Ashley Farm. They farmed with cattle, and then right up till 1967 when New Horizons Township was established. There's a few things I wanted to show you also before we get into it. The one thing I'd like to show you is the Sunday Times magazine of 11 February 1973. And on the front cover of this magazine is Mr. George Langdown. And it says there, Plettenberg Bay's last coloured. I'll explain to you what happened. The Group Areas Act forced all the coloured people to move from central Plettenberg Bay to New Horizons Township from 1967 when the township was being built and developed. And the last person who refused to move was this gentleman, Mr. George Langdown. This was 1973 already, and he still refused to move. So this made national headlines. The Sunday Times national magazine came to Plettenberg Bay, interviewed George Langdown. He refused to move. The apartheid government forced him to move out of his comfortable home in Plettenberg Bay Central. And if you open this, let me do so. You'll see it says Plettenberg Bay's last coloured, and Mr. George Langdown, as the bulldozers were approaching to demolish his house in central Plettenberg Bay, he refused to move. So they demolished his house and they moved him forcefully to a place where he had to live in New Horizons. It is Willow Crescent. It is right opposite where I live at the moment. So the house, which is the Anglican Church house, where the Anglican Church priest lives in Willow Crescent, New Horizons, that is where George Langdown eventually lived. But yes, he made headlines because he refused to move. That's the one thing I wanted to show you, which I find quite interesting, and especially the national headlines. The other thing I'd like to show you is the building contract of my grandmother, Bertha Dunn, as she was also forced to move to New Horizons Township, and her house was built and completed in October, 31 October 1972, and the builder was Mr. Kurt. My grandmother paid an amount of 9,000 Rand to have her house built. It's the same house where she still lives, and I'll show you a picture later of Erf 2229, Willow Crescent, New Horizons. We live right next to it. This was the building plan of my grandmother, Bertha Dinah Dunn. The house was completed 31 October 1972. The building plan does mention Erf 2229. It doesn't mention the word New Horizons. It mentions the word Coloured Township, Plettenberg Bay. And that's why I brought this building plan with, to show you, because I find it very interesting that it was not named New Horizons by that time yet. It was simply named Coloured Township, Plettenberg Bay. So this is the building plan of my grandmother's house, which still stands right now. Apart from that, I have many news articles and other little things which I'd like to share with you and show you. New Horizons was a cattle farm, and it belonged to the Topless family at the beginning of the 20th century. A very small part of the farm also belonged to Taste Cup. And what happened that Robert Charles Harker and Mary Harker, they lived on the farm of the Topless family. They farmed there with cattle and specifically oxen, because oxen had to go and carry logs for them and fetch water for them. And then they decided to buy part of the farm. So whenever they slaughtered cattle and whenever they sold cattle, they saved money. And by the bits of money that they saved, they bought part of the farm. It was called Ashley Farm at that time. It's here where New Horizons is. So Robert Charles Harker and his wife Mary Harker, they bought part of the farm in 1958. I just want to make sure if my dates are correctly. No, 1953. And 1953, that was the year when their son Cecil Harker arrived back in Plettenberg Bay from the army, and he helped his father, Robert Charles Harker, to build that house. So that time they didn't buy bricks. There was no Vantel. There was no Denron. They made their own bricks. I find that very, very interesting, that they built their house with bricks that they made. And that's the first house here in New Horizons. That house is still standing at the moment. It's bought over from Cecil Harker in 1987 by Smakes Witbooi. We all know Smakes bus service. So Smartryk and Joy Witbooi bought the house in 1987. I also want to show you a few pictures of my family. These are my grandparents and my dad as a little boy and his brother as a little boy as they lived in central Plettenberg Bay, and that was the time before they were forcefully removed obviously by the Group Areas Act. Let me tell you a bit of the Group Areas Act. That act was initiated in South Africa in 1950. But although it was initiated in our country in 1950, it was only initiated in our town, Plettenberg Bay, in 1967, when the erven were, the plots were developed and the water was led here in New Horizons Township. Before that, they all lived down in central town. I have a few other news articles that I'd like to share with you. This one also speaks of my family and the forced removals. So this is a talk which we had at the Van Plettenberg Historical Society, and it speaks of the forced removals and what my family had to go through, and many other families sadly had to experience because of the Group Areas Act of 1950. Another picture I'd like to show you is also a news article. It says Victorian cottage demolished. And this Victorian cottage, this is the original house that my grandfather, Michael William Dunn, built in Kloof Street, Plettenberg Bay, for his family in 1937. So this cottage was built in 1937 by my grandfather, Michael William Dunn, as I said. And in 1991, this cottage was demolished to build the Melville Spa car park. So it's very sad that a historic cottage had to be demolished to build a car park. And then this picture I'd like to share with you. It's a picture of my family, and that was also when they lived in that beautiful little home, that Victorian cottage, which they named Victoria Cottage. My grandfather named it when he built it in 1937. That's also my family. My mom, Joey Dunn, before she got married to my dad, Mac Dunn, when she was still Joey Williams from Mossel Bay, she's the one on this photograph with the short black hair. She's the one with the short black hair. That's my mom. So yeah, it's very sad that people had to be forcefully removed. And as I said, 1967 was a sad time. People were removed from homes that they've lived all their lives, and they had to be moved to what then was known as New Horizons Township, the first coloured township here in Plettenberg Bay. The only people who were not affected were the Griqua people, because they were already in Plettenberg Bay since 1920. So this year being the year 2020 is quite a remarkable and historic year because it shows the centenary celebration of the Griqua people of when they arrived in Plettenberg Bay in March 1920. This brochure which I'm showing you is the Golden Jubilee celebrations of the Griqua people. It was in March 1970 when they were here in Plet for 50 years, and my parents were also honored guests over there. Yeah, so let me get back to New Horizons. The township was built in 1967, and there's many things that I can remember as I have grown up here. On the east border of New Horizons was a little farm called Eikenhof. And Eikenhof belonged to the Parfait family. They were from Cape Town, and they asked Mr. Sam Pale to come and work for them on their farm. So the Pale family lived on Eikenhof farm. They looked after the house, they looked after the sheep, the cattle, everything. And in the early 1990s, that farm was taken. It was sold for municipal housing, and nowadays people still call it Pizzaplaas. And the reason why it's called Pizzaplaas is because Piet Pale was the heir of the farm. He inherited the farm from Mrs. Parfait. That's because the Pale family worked on the farm all those years. On the west border of New Horizons was the main entrance to New Horizons at the N2, there where Picas buses are at the moment. And of course, that time there was no Picas buses. And the interesting thing that I can remember of the west border of New Horizons at the N2 is that the N2 was much further away. It was another 500 meters away. That's before the new N2 was built. And at the entrance of New Horizons, of course, everything was gravel roads in New Horizons itself. And at the entrance of New Horizons, there was 2 pillars, and it's 2 brick pillars. And there was almost like a brick wall at the front part at the entrance of New Horizons. I remember as a little child, and as children we went and walked on that wall. The stone pillar, and how we got onto those pillars at the entrance of New Horizons. I find it quite interesting. Yeah, and apparently the reason why there was a wall was that it kept cattle out. I also want to show you the picture of my grandmother's house. This was the house that she completed and moved into on 31 October 1972. The house is still standing at the moment, and when my granny Bertha died in 1986, we sold the house to Charles Botha. So Edna and Jacques Botha are still living in the same house, and it is still 2229 Willow Crescent, New Horizons, exact same house. I also remember visiting Oma Mary Harker, and she is the person I've spoken about. She is Iris Dixon's mother. Remember I mentioned of Iris Dixon, the one who gave me a lot of this info, the lady who's born in 1933, and she still lives here in New Horizons. She's now 87 years old. Well, her mother was Mary Harker, and her father was Robert Charles Harker, who built the original house here in New Horizons, the first house in New Horizons, before it was called New Horizons, the house that was built in 1953. And she told me, Auntie Iris told me that they had 2 dams here. The one dam was very close to where we live at the moment in Willow Crescent. It was there where George Langdown's house used to be. That was the dam for the oxen to drink. And the other dam was behind the clinic in New Horizons, where Alan and Henry Harker used to live. That used to be another dam. And that's where they got water for the oxen. But they couldn't drink the water. So they always received water from the people who lived in town. They remember how Mr. Reggie Corrolisin used to bring water for them to drink. So yes, as a little boy, I remember Oma Mary Harker. I remember visiting her there in that original house, which is on the corner of Keerboom and Syringa, where Joy Witboy still lives at the moment. And I remember little things of Oma Mary Harker. I remember she had a mulberry tree. The plot was very big. She had an old farmhouse. Obviously, it's been built by their own bricks that they made. I remember the huge pantry in the house, and the kitchen was a very big kitchen, almost with a indoor fireplace kind of effect and with a wooden stove. I also remember that she had chickens, and she had some wooden attached houses or wooden rooms that she built on the outside, which she rented out for people. The one gentleman who rented and stayed by Oma Mary Harker was my uncle Roland Harker. He stayed there. And then also Robert and Mary Harker built 2 other houses here in this area in 1953 when they built their house. The one house they built for Flippy Windvogel, and he was also a gentleman who looked after the property of Mary and Robert Harker. And the other house that they built was for Rosie Paulser and her family. So they were also looking after the Harker's property, and they were also looking after the farm. So therefore there was they had their houses over here. So let's look at the other border. The south border of New Horizons is at the place where we know it nowadays as being pine trees and Bossiesgif. Bossiesgif is quite interesting because Bossiesgif, it was actually called Bishop's Gift, believe me or not. And that whole property belonged to the Anglican Church bishop. And in 1972, the first Xhosa family moved to Plettenberg Bay. Yes, there were no Xhosa people and no African people living in Plettenberg Bay during the pre-apartheid years. It was only the colored people who had property in central Plettenberg Bay, also in the town area, Pisang Valley area, Brito and Keerboom's area, and then down at the Crags area. But of course all of them were moved to New Horizons Township in 1967. So yes, Bossiesgif was known as Bishop's Gift, a gift from the bishop. The ground belonged to the Anglican Church of the Formosa diocese. And the first African family, the first Xhosa family who moved here to Bossiesgif in 1972 was the family of Robert and Margaret Grootboom. They came in from the Eastern Cape to work in houses of people, and they lived in Bossiesgif. So that was the only family living in Bossiesgif. That was the south border of New Horizons, the Pine Tree, Bossiesgif area. I also spoke to Eddie Wentworth, and he's a gentleman who was teaching in Plettenberg Bay many years ago. Eddie Wentworth is still alive at the moment, and he's 88 years old at the moment. And he also lived, and his house is still there, near to the Pine Trees area, near to die Gaaitjie, near to Bossiesgif. That's where Wentworth lives. Then the north border of New Horizons, that is the place which we know now as Ebenezer. But Ebenezer had a different name then. It was called Suriname Farm. So that time before this area was called New Horizons, when it was still Ashley Farm bordered different farms. The one was Suriname Farm on the north, which is now Ebenezer. The other farm, which Ashley Farm bordered next to, was Weldon Farm. We all know where Weldon Kaya is, so that part was Weldon Farm. And the other farm next to Ashley Farm was Hillview Farm. So Hillview Farm, it's now part of Ladywood. That was all Hillview Farm, and Hillview stretched from Ladywood right up to what we know now as Quanakatula, that was built in 1991. Right up past Quanakatula, there were the Plet Christian School is, Ebenezer is, Suriname. That was all called Hillview Farm, and it was right next to Ashley Farm, which is now New Horizons. So when New Horizons was established in 1967, the mayor of Plettenberg Bay was Mr. J.R. Camp. And Mr. Camp, he had a group of representatives, and they were sent to Ashley Farm to come and speak to Robert Charles Harker and Mary Harker, and they forced them to either sell their property to the town council of 1967 under the auspices of J.R. Camp. They were forced to either sell their property to the town council for coloured housing, and they were told by Graham Monk. Graham Monk was one of the representatives that Mr. J.R. Camp sent out to come and speak to Robert and Mary Harker about their property, which they had to give up now, and if they did not want to sell it to the town council, it would be taken from them. So the two options that the town council had, one was Roodefontein, where it was known as Rooifontein. So either the coloured people would have lived in Roodefontein, where the St. Andrew's Church is, and the Plettenberg Bay Country Club and Golf Course is right now, down Pisang Valley. And if they didn't get that right, they would go to option 2, which would be the property belonging to Robert and Mary Harker. And they were told that if they do not sell it to the town council, they would forcefully be removed from their property. Well, their property was taken. They received a stipend, and they were allowed to live here. The rest of the plots were cut around them. Water was laid in 1967. Their own children, including Iris Dixon, because Iris Harker then married Raymond Dixon. So their own children even had to buy property then, because it was taken from the parents and they had to purchase it. They couldn't just live here any longer. But the parents, Robert and Mary Harker, they continued living there and they stayed there. The different roads in New Horizons were all named after indigenous trees. For example, the street where I live, it is Willow Crescent. There was a willow tree. So all the original streets that were cut in 1967 were named after indigenous trees that grew here. That's why you get Keerboom Road here in New Horizons. You get Keerboom Street, you get Geelhout, you get Swarthout, you get Bluegum, because Bluegum was an indigenous tree. Yeah, you get the willow and all the different Kershout and all these trees. So the streets were named after the trees in New Horizons. So that was the part of the old New Horizons. The old New Horizons stretched up to Keerboom Road, where the Sterreweg is at the moment, the Sterreweg Daycare Center for Special Needs Children, and that's where New Horizons ended. It ended at the Sterreweg, and that's where the school was built as well, Formosa Primary School. I'll tell you about that. So above Formosa Primary School, there where the cemetery is, there was nothing. There was no houses, but I'll get back to that. I first want to tell you a little bit of the streets. As I said, it's all named after trees in New Horizons. And the new New Horizons, so that was the old New Horizons of 1967. The new New Horizons was built in 1991, just after Plet Secondary School was built. So now I have this which I'd like to show you. Plet Secondary School, Feesblad. And this proves to us that Plet Secondary School at Ebenezer, right next to New Horizons, was built in 1991. And that's the time when those other streets in New Horizons were built between the school, between Formosa Primary School, the cemetery, and all the way up to Ebenezer Estate, where the Plet Secondary School was built. Let me tell you a few interesting things about Plet Secondary School, because my dad, Mac Dunn, also was one of the teachers who went and started off Plet Secondary School in 1991. They were co-opted. They were taken from Formosa Primary School where they worked. And the first school principal in 1991 was John Mothlabani. John Mothlabani started off the school, and my dad, Mac Dunn, as well, and a few other teachers. I remember Oki Charles, for example, the late Oki Charles, also from New Horizons, and they went and started off the Plet Secondary School in 1991. So the interesting thing is that the streets that were erected in New Horizons then, in 1991, they were not named after trees like the old New Horizons. They were named after people. For example, there's Lewendal Street. Lewendal, that was the first pastor who came to Plettenberg Bay in the 1970s, Pastor Glenn Lewendal. He came from George, and he was the first governing body chairperson of Formosa Primary School. I'll tell you now about Formosa Primary School and how it was established in 1969 and was the first public building here in New Horizons. So there was Lewendal Street that was erected in 1991. The next street, there was Corrolisin Street. Corrolisin was the first principal of Formosa Primary School in 1969. He was Reginald Corrolisin, and he came from the West Coast, Saldanha Bay, West Coast. Then there's a Dunn Street, but they call it Dunn Close because a close is like a little cul-de-sac, but it's Dunn Street. Dunn is my grandfather who started the first multiracial school in 1912 called the St. Peter's Mission School, and when that school was moved to the Coloured Township in 1969, and when the Western Cape Education Department, which was then called Coloured Affairs, when Coloured Affairs took over, they started and they called the school, instead of keeping the name St. Peter's Mission School, they changed it to Formosa Primary School, seeing that Formosa, Bahia Formosa, was the first name of Plettenberg Bay. Bahia Formosa meaning beautiful bay, which is a Portuguese name because the Portuguese started Plettenberg Bay. So Formosa Primary School 1969. So that's why there's a Dunn Street as well, named after my grandfather Michael William Dunn and my dad Mac Dunn, who was co-opted to go and start the Plet Secondary School in 1991. The other street there is also a Miriam Roy Street. And who is Miriam Roy? Miriam Roy was the first social worker who came and started off New Horizons. So yes, there was two types of housing in New Horizons. There was the sub-economical municipal housing that the town council started in 1967. And apart from the sub-economical municipal housing, there was also private housing. I'll tell you about that now. So the municipal housing, house number 1 was in Blue Gum Street, and that house now belongs to John Hartnick, still living here in New Horizons. So house number 1, it used to be a little municipal office here in New Horizons. It was the first municipal